Our support for One Nation has slumped in the latest Resolve strategic poll, with the party dropping by 3 points while the coalition increased by the same amount. Labor stayed the same but became the leader in the primary vote. Pauline Hanson suffered an even worse result when it came to preferred Prime Minister, falling by 8 points compared to last month. Anthony Albanese and Angus Taylor both lifted in support. For their take, let's bring in One Nation MP Barnaby Joyce and Community Strong MP Allegra Spender. Good morning to both of you. Barnaby, so the pollsters say migrants and women were the two biggest groups where you lost support. Have your party's positions on multiculturalism, abortion and parental leave hurt you, do you think?
Well, I've always said, haven't I, on this program, that the polls are an indicator, they're not a vote. And you always expect there to be fluctuation in polls as you go through a process. I think that what there is an indication is that Pauline Hanson is direct. She doesn't try and gild the lily. She's straight down the barrel with what she says. And issues such as when she said monoculturalism, of course, we have a choice in Australia. We can have multiculturalism, which means you're accepting of a whole range of things, which may be anathema to the Australian people, or you can have an Australian culture which has to work within guardrails. And I believe that's well supported, the idea that you have guardrails that clearly say that you must work in a form that can interact, that respects other people's liberties and views. And if you want to have views outside the guardrails, then it's untenable for Australia.
And when she says big things like that, big sort of policy ideas, I guess, and then dips 8 points, which is significant in, I know it's only one poll, do you think that has affected her? Paid parental leave got a lot of coverage, and so did the monoculture. Has that affected her?
Well, I think that people understand that one of the big things about One Nation, one of the big things about Pauline is social cohesion and making sure that the issues, especially what we saw tragically at Bondi, are not repeated. And it requires a substantive statement. You've got to be brave enough to make it. If you don't want to make it, then I suppose you accept that it'll happen again and again and again, and each time we'll say, oh, that's terrible. No, that's not good enough. You have to say, well, we have to have a clear statement about what is appropriate in being an Australian citizen and being part of this nation, that you have to respect other people. It's not a statement about people's colour or their creed or their religion. It's a statement about how people act, and a statement about the paradigm and the guardrails which you have to work within as part of that Australian culture. As I've said before, without being trite, there are many other cultures and there are sections of them which are untenable. They're tenable for that culture, but not tenable for an Australian culture.
Allegra, you've just formed a minor party of your own. Are voters heading back to the two main parties, or is this just one poll?
Look, we will see. As said, I think polls are polls, but I think what's most important is actually really talking to people and listening to people. And I think that, in terms of what's going on right now, families are hurting. And I'm not surprised they walked away from Pauline Hanson when she said things like, getting rid of paid parental leave, because families are really hurting. That's actually one of the reasons why they're going away from the major parties. And I do want to call into contrast into what Barnaby Joyce just said about monoculture and multiculture. Because in my family, we were immigrants. My mum was Italian, stepped off the boat with no English, made a huge contribution to the country. And we grew up in a culture where we had the best of Italian culture, but we knew every single day that we were Australian. We don't need to have this fight of monoculturalism or multiculturalism, because I'm really proud that Australia has people from around the world, and we get on and we know what our Australian values are and we hold on to those. And I think honestly, if you've got politicians like Pauline Hanson saying that she doesn't think there are any good Muslims, then it is about faiths. It is about saying some people don't belong here, and I think that is actually really damaging and actually quite dangerous for our country. So I really stand up against what's has been said. I don't think you can gild the lily on this one. I think what Pauline Hanson has said about different parts of our country are really wrong, and I think what I focus on more is I want to fight extremism. There is extremism in this country. It has no place. Violent extremism of any creed has no place. But, having a go at people just on the basis of religion, that's not Australian either.
Okay, Barnaby, she's saying they're two very different things.
Well, what I've seen there is Allegra's given an incredibly good example of how her family, who came into Australia from Italy, and I congratulate them, are working within the Australian guardrails of the Australian culture. I think she gave a splendid example there of precisely how you work within the Australian culture. I can see just from her presence in the Parliament that she's working within the Australian guardrails. Another issue that she said is that we make the presumption that some people don't belong here. Correct? They don't. Some people don't belong here. If you believe in, for instance, that other people's rights are diminished next to yours, that you have a license to kill them, that it's part of your religion, that you want to take it to the literal extent that people who are gay can be thrown off buildings, no, you don't belong here. So I stand by that. And I think that the statement of an Australian culture is something that's absolutely apparent. If you live in Saudi Arabia, you must be part of an Islamic culture. If you live in Thailand, you're part of a Buddhist culture. There's a Shinto culture. In Japan, we have an Australian culture, and I don't think we should be embarrassed about it.
Allegra, the word monoculture seems to be what people are stuck on. Do you think that's the problem here? The definition, even the coalition couldn't, spent 2 days trying to work out whether we're a multicultural society.
Look, I think there's this sense of that we should be, that Australians, monoculture says, oh, we look and sound the same, we all think the same on all things.
Well, no, that's what you say.
I think we do have Australian values. So I think we have values around you tolerating others of different opinions. I think that's absolutely critical. I think the rule of law, our democratic institutions, those are really the heartland of Australia. Of that, you live and let live. Those that we are a peaceful nation and that we are peaceful with each other, those are the Australian culture. But you don't have to give up other parts of your culture. And I think, I do want to come back to this point, Barnaby, in relation to Muslim Australians, because I think, the comments here are really unfair to a group of Australians who make an enormous contribution to this country. The extremist groups of any part of our country, I have a problem with. We should be doing everything we can, to get rid of extremism. But I think, let's be honest, that, particularly Pauline Hanson has said, look, I don't think there are any good Muslims out there, and I think that is really dangerous in this country. So I think we've got to, and that is the sort of underlying piece when you say monoculture, is to say there's some people who are okay and some people.
Allegra,
why did you say that then, Barnaby?
Well, Allegra, because if you
don't... No, genuinely, why did
Allegra,
you say that?
Allegra, you've got to let me speak, okay? Now, Allegra, if you don't have a monoculture, you're going to have multiculturalism, which is a belief that whatever culture you have, it's applicable, and that's not. I don't agree with that. Everything you said, where you talked about temperance, Allegra, is precisely what we're talking about. You have to have temperance within your views in such a form as it fits within the guardrails of an Australian culture. And then you've gone out and sort of said, well, your Allegra Spender's interpretation of monoculture, well, that's Allegra Spender for Allegra Spender to explain her form of monoculture. It is not what we've said.
Yeah, okay. We'll have to leave it there, but it does feel like there are several different definitions of what a multicultural society is. But we do have to leave it there. We have to get to the news. Thank you very much for your time. We'll see you next week.